The Dalai Lama spurs hate. China warned U.S. President Barack Obama that any meeting with the exiled Tibetan spiritual leader would shatter the already shaky U.S.-China relations. China is already on the outs with the U.S. after President Obama announced the sale of $6.3 billion worth of arms to Taiwan. Well, joining me to talk about China's warning to the U.S. is investigative journalist Webster Tarpley. Webster, thanks so much for joining me. So first of all, normally it's the United States that threatens or imposes sanctions on other countries, but now it seems like the reverse might be happening. Is this the beginning of a new era in the world, or maybe more specifically between the United States and China?
The Chinese may sanction an entire array of U.S. aerospace companies, starting with Boeing, Northrop Grumman, many others. But I think there's a big picture. The U.S. is antagonizing China in a very large number of ways. The way the Chinese see it, the U.S. is meddling in Tibet with the Dalai Lama coming this month, meddling in Taiwan with the last $6 billion plus arms sale. There's meddling in the Uyghurs of Xinjiang province, a group that's sponsored by the U.S. government. The Chinese object to what the U.S. is doing in the South China Sea, which they regard as territorial waters, and then in cyberspace with the Google conflict. In economics, there's a conflict over the proper valuation of the renminbi, where the Chinese have a fixed parity. And then trade protectionism. This, I think, is an area where the U.S. actually needs more. But then we get into the multilateral areas, and this is where it gets thorny and hard to control. On Copenhagen, the U.S. and the British resent the Chinese for blocking this idea of a world carbon dictatorship, which would have been used then to strangle the development of China, India, and a bunch of others. And then we get to the real hotspot, I think, which is the Gulf and Iran. And I would point everybody to the speech given by Secretary Clinton in Paris last week at the École Militaire, where she basically says to China, you have the following choice. You should vote for sanctions against Iran. That will mean 10% of your oil may be cut off, $80 billion in deals, and your main hope of having a safe and secure overland pipeline through Iran, that'll go out the window. And if you don't, Israel may be unleashed. They may attack Iran, and that may close the Straits of Hormuz. Right. And at that point, you'll lose 1/3 of your oil. So they think they've got the Chinese in a bind.
Got it. And so you say, the United States is maybe provoking China, but it seems like this is a turning point here in U.S.-Chinese relationships and possibly for the world that, that China is starting to threaten the United States. I mean, how is this going to, what does the future look like? Will the United States have to start consulting China before they make big decisions like who to sell arms to?
Well, it's only a threat if you assume that the U.S. is going to be economically stagnant in the current form. The U.S. elite right now is obsessed with the idea that China is overtaking the U.S. And, well, they might, because they are. They're now the largest exporter in the world. They're going to pass Japan to become the second largest economy in the world. The question for the U.S. is, are you going to rely on economic warfare and fomenting conflict in the Gulf with Iran as a gambit, fomenting conflict between China and India, or do you take the rational view, which is to say, let's have a peace race of economic development? Just a couple of points. The Chinese are building 20 nuclear reactors. The U.S. is lucky to build one. The U.S. wants to keep up, build 20, build 40. Fast rail. The Chinese have maglev. They have the best bullet train in the world. They're building 16,000 miles of fast rail, $300 billion. Obama's saying, I'll spend $12 billion. Above all, space. The Chinese are going to the moon. Based on Obama's budget, the U.S. is going nowhere.
Right.
And if the U.S. elite doesn't want to fall behind, they've got to keep up. In other words, that means make massive investments in each one of those areas.
So obviously, the Chinese have said that they're not happy about President Barack Obama's plans to meet with the Dalai Lama. And mysteriously, the Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg's plans to visit China have been canceled. So it seems like there's a lot going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of tension. How can this tension be resolved?
Again, by the U.S. making the rational choice. If you go down this conflict-fomenting economic warfare road, that's the road to world tragedy for everybody. On the other hand, you choose the peace race, everybody could benefit. The U.S. Has to understand this is now a real superpower rivalry with a power which is really in economic terms already ahead, in terms of real economics, because the U.S. gross domestic product counts things like derivatives, credit default swaps. The U.S. now has an economy which is great for Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, but when it comes to the things on which real economic power are based, the U.S. is basically nowhere and drifting even further into backwardness.
And really quickly, a Chinese official said in Beijing the other day that we will take corresponding measures to make the relevant countries realize their mistakes, obviously referring to President Obama's meeting with the Dalai Lama. What kind of corresponding measures could the Chinese take here?
Well, the obvious one is this sanctioning of Boeing, and it works even through the U.S. Congress. In other words, if the Chinese say, look, Boeing, we're depriving you of this tremendous market in China, at that point that's going to mean a U.S. political crisis expressed through the Congress. The U.S. is just too weak economically to withstand that kind of thing, and Obama's probably too weak politically. So it might be a healthy shock to realize that you're no longer the sole superpower or hyperpower, that you're dealing with countries that are, in this case, every bit your equal and maybe you're superior.
Well, Webster, thank you so much for joining me. And, of course, we'll see what those, quote, corresponding measures are for the United States when it comes to President Obama's meeting with the Dalai Lama.